I shall continue with Jamie Faulkner's Moonfleet, with Chapter 5, The Rescue. Shades of the dead, have I not heard your voices rise on the night-rolling breath of the gale? Byron. When I came to myself, I was lying not in the outer blackness of the Mohune vault, nor on a floor of sand, but in a bed of sweet, clean linen, and in a little whitewashed room, through the window of which the spring sunlight streamed. Oh, the blessed sunshine, and how I praised God for the light! At first I thought I was in my own bed at my aunt's house, and had dreamed of the vault and the smugglers, and that my being prisoned in the darkness was but the horror of a nightmare. I was for getting up, but fell back on my pillow in the effort to rise, with a weakness and sick languor which I've never known before. And as I sunk down, I felt something swing about my neck, and putting up my hand, found 'twas Colonel John Mohune's black locket, so knew that part, at least, of this adventure was no dream. Then the door opened, and to my wandering thought it seemed that I was back again in the vault, for in came Elzevir Block. Then I held up my hands and cried, "Oh, Elzevir, save me, save me! I am not come to spy!" But he, with a kind look on his face, put his hand on my shoulder and pushed me gently back, saying, "Lie still, lad. There is none here will hurt thee, and drink this." He held out to me a bowl of steaming broth that filled the room with a savour sweeter 10,000 times to me than every rose and lily of the world, yet would not let me drink it at a gulp, but made me sip it with a spoon like any baby. Thus, while I drank, he told me where I was, namely in an attic at the Why Not, but would not say more then, bidding me to get to sleep again, and I should know all afterwards. And so it was 10 days or more before youth and health had their way, and I was strong again. And all that time Elzevir Block sat by my bed, and nursed me tenderly as a woman. So, piece by piece, I learned the story of how they found me. 'Twas Mr. Glennie who first moved to seek me, for when the second day came that I was not at school, he thought that I was ill, and went to my aunt's to ask how I did, as was his wont when any ailed. But Aunt Jane answered him stiffly that she could not say how I did. "For," says she, "he is run off I know not where, but as he makes his bed he must lie on it, and if he run away for his pleasure may stay away for mine. I have been pestered with this lot too long, and only bore with him for his poor sister Martha's sake, but 'tis after his father that the graceless lad takes, and thus rewards me." With that she bangs the door in the parson's face, and off he goes to Ratsey, but can learn nothing there, and so concludes that I have run away to sea, and am seeking ship at Poole or Weymouth. But that same day came Sam Tewkesbury to the Why Not about nightfall, and begged a glass of rum, being, as he said, all of a shake, and telling a tale of how he passed the churchyard wall on his return from work, and in the dusk heard screams and wailing voices, and knew 'twas Blackbeard piping his lost Mohunes to hunt for treasure. So, though he saw nothing, he turned tail, and never stopped running till he stood at the inn door. Then, forthwith, Elzevir leaves Sam to drink at the Why Not alone, and himself sets off running up the street to call for Master Ratsey, and they two make straight across the sea meadows in the dark. "For as soon as I heard Tewkesbury tell of screams and wailings in the air, and no one to be seen," said Elzevir, "I guessed that some poor soul had got shut in the vault, and was there crying for his life. And to this I was not guided by Mother Wit, but by a surer and sadder token. Thou wilt have heard how 13 years ago a daft body we called Cracky Jones was found one morning in the churchyard, dead. He was gone, missing for a week before, and twice within that week I had sat through the night upon the hill behind the church, watching to warn the lugger with a flare she could not put in for the surf upon the beach. And on those nights, the air being still, though a heavy swell was running, I heard thrice or more a throttled scream coming shivering across the meadows from the graveyard. Yet, beyond turning my blood cold for a moment, It gave me little trouble, for evil tales have hung about the church, and though I did not set much store by the old yarns of Blackbeard piping up his crew, yet I thought strange things might well go on among the graves at night, and so I never budged, nor stirred hand or foot to save a fellow creature in his agony. But when the surf fell enough for the boats to get ashore, and Greening held a lantern for me to jump down into the passage, after we had got the side out the tomb, the first thing the light fell on at the bottom was a white face turned skyward. I've not forgot that, lad, for 'twas Cracky Jones lay there, with his face thin and shrunk, yet all the doited look gone out of it. We tried to force some brandy in his mouth, but he was stark and dead, with knees drawn up towards his head, so stiff we had to lift him double as he was and lay him by the churchyard wall for some of us to find the next day. We never knew how we got there, but guessed that he had hung about the landers some night when they ran a cargo, and slipped in when the watchman's back was turned. Thus, when Sam Tewkesbury spoke of screams and wailings and no one to be seen, I knew what 'twas, but never guessed who might be shut in there, not knowing thou wert gone a-missing. So ran to Ratsey to get his help to slip the side stone off, for by myself I cannot stir it now, though once I did when I was younger, and from him learned that thou wert lost, and knew whom we should find before we got there. I shuddered while Elzevir talked, for I thought how Cracky Jones had perhaps hidden behind the self-same coffin that sheltered me, and how narrowly I had escaped his fate. And that old story came back into my mind, how, years ago, there once arose so terrible a cry from the vault at service time that parson and people fled from the church, and I doubted not now that some other poor soul had got shut in that awful place, and was then calling for help to those whose fears would not let them listen. "There we found thee," Elzevir went on, "stretched out on the sand, senseless and far gone. And there was something in thy face that made me think of David when he lay stretched out on his last sleep. And so I put thee on my shoulder and bare thee back, and here thou art in David's room, and shalt find board and bed with me as long as thou hast mind to." We spoke much together during the days when I was getting stronger, and I grew to like Elzevir well, finding his grimness was but on the outside, and that never was a kinder man. Indeed, I think that my being with him did him good, for he felt that there was once more someone to love him, and his heart went out to me as to his son David. Never once did he ask me to keep my counsel as to the vault, and what I had seen there, knowing, perhaps, he had no need, for I would have died rather than tell the secret to any. Only one day Master Ratsey, who often came to see me, said, "John, there is only Elzevir and I who know that you have seen the inside of our bond cellar, and 'tis well, for as some of the landers guessed, they might have ugly ways to stop all chance of prating. So keep our secret tight, and we'll keep yours, for he that refraineth his lips is wise." I wondered how Master Ratsey could quote scripture so pat, and yet cheat the revenue. Though in truth 'twas thought little sin at Moonfleet to run a cargo, and perhaps he guessed what I was thinking, for he added, "Not that a Christian man has aught to be ashamed of in landing a cask of good liquor, for we read that when Israel came out of Egypt, the chosen people were bid trick their oppressors out of jewels of silver and jewels of gold, and among those cruel taskmasters some of the worst must certainly have been the tax-gatherers." The first walk I took when I grew stronger was able to get about was up to Aunt Jane's, notwithstanding she had never so much as been to ask after me all these days. She knew, indeed, where I was, for Ratsey had told her I lay at the Why Not, explaining that Elzevir had found me one night on the ground, famished and half dead, yet not saying where. But my aunt greeted me with hard words, which I need not repeat here, for perhaps she meant them not unkindly, but only to bring me back again to the right way. She did not let me cross the threshold, holding the door ajar in her hand, and saying she would have no tavern loungers in her house, but that if I liked the Why Not so well, I could go back there again for her. I had been for begging her pardon for playing truant, but when I heard such scurvy words, felt the devil rise in my heart, and only laughed, though bitter tears were in my eyes. So I turned my back upon the only home that I had ever known, and sauntered off down the village, feeling very lone, and I'm not sure I was not crying before I came again to the Why Not. Then Elzevir saw that my face was downcast, and asked what ailed me, and so I told him how my aunt had turned me away, and that I had no home to go to. But he seemed pleased rather than sorry, and said that I must come now and live with him, for he had plenty for both, and that since chance had led him to save my life, I should be to him a son in David's place. So I went to keep house with him at the Why Not, and my aunt sent down my bag of clothes, and would have made over to Elzevir the pittance that my father left for my keep, but he said it was not needful, and he would have none of it. Chapter 6. An Assault. Surely, after all, the noblest answer unto such is perfect stillness when they brawl. Tennyson. I have more than once brought up the name of Mr. Maskew, and, as I shall have other things to tell of him later on, I may as well relate here what manner of man he was. His stature was but medium, not exceeding 5 feet 4 inches, I think, and to make the most of it he flung his head far back and gave himself a little strut in walking. He had a thin face with a sharp nose that looked as if it would peck you, and grey eyes that could pierce a millstone if there was a guinea on the far side of it. His hair, for he wore his own, had been red, though it was now grizzled, and the colour of it was set down in Moonfleet to his being a Scotchman, for we thought all Scotchmen were red-headed. He was a lawyer by profession, and having made money in Edinburgh, had gone so far south as Moonfleet to get quit, as was said, of the memories of rascally deeds. It was about 4 years since he bought a parcel of the Mohune estate, which had been breaking up and selling piecemeal for a generation, and on his land stood the manor house, or so much of it was left. Of the mansion I have spoken before. It was a very long house of 2 stories, with a projecting gable and doorway in the middle, and at each end gabled wings running out crosswise. The Maskews lived in one of these wings, and that was the only habitable portion of the place, for as to the rest the glass was out of the windows, and in some places the roofs had fallen in. Mr. Maskew made no attempt to repair house or grounds, and the bough of the great cedar which the snows had brought down in '49 still blocked the drive. The entrance to the house was through the porchway in the middle, but more than one tumble-down corridor had to be threaded before one reached the inhabited wing, while fowls and pigs and squirrels had possession of the terrace lawns in front. It was not for want of money that Maskew let things remain thus, for men said that he was rich enough, only that his mood was miserly, and perhaps also it was the lack of woman's company that made him think so little of neatness and order, for his wife was dead, and though he had a daughter, she was young, and had not yet weight enough to make her father do things that he did not choose. Till Maskew came, there had been none living in the manor house for a generation, so the village children used the terrace for a playground, and picked primroses in the woods, and the men thought they had a right to snare a rabbit or shoot a pheasant in the chase. But the new owner changed all this, hiding gins and spring guns in the coverts, and nailing up boards on the trees to say he would have the law of any that trespassed. So he soon made enemies for himself, and before long had everyone's hand against him. Yet he preferred his neighbours' enmity to their goodwill, and went about to make it more bitter by getting himself posted for magistrate, and giving out that he would put down the contraband thereabouts. For no one round Moonfleet was for the excise, but farmers loved a glass of schnapps that had never been gauged, and their wives a piece of fine lace from France. And then came the affair between the Elector and the Ketch, with David Block's death. And after that they said it was not safe for Maskew to walk at large, and that he would be found some day dead on the down. But he gave no heed to it, and went on as if he had been a paid exciseman rather than a magistrate. When I was a little boy, the manor woods were my delight, and many a sunny afternoon have I sat on the terrace edge, looking down over the village and munching red quarantines from the ruined fruit gardens. And though this was now forbidden, yet the manor had still a sweeter attraction to me than apples or bird batting, and that was Grace Maskew. She was an only child, and about my own age, or little better, at the time of which I am speaking. I knew her because she went every day to the old almshouses to be taught by the Reverend Mr. Glennie, from whom I also received my schooling. She was tall for her age, and slim, with a thin face and a tumble of tawny hair, which flew about her in a wind or when she ran. Her frocks were washed and patched and faded, and showed more of her arms and legs than the dressmaker had ever intended, for she was a growing girl, and had none to look after her clothes. She was a favourite playfellow with all, and an early choice for games of prisoner's base, and she could beat most of us boys at speed. Thus, though we all hated her father, and had for him many jeering titles among ourselves, yet we never used an evil nickname nor a railing word against him when she was by, because we liked her well. There were a half-dozen of us boys, and as many girls whom Mr. Glennie used to teach, and that you may see what sort of man Maskew was, I will tell you what happened one day in school between him and the parson. Mr. Glennie taught us in the almshouses, for though there were now no bedesmen and the houses themselves were fallen to decay, yet the little hall in which the inmates had once dined was still maintained, and served for our schoolroom. It was a long and lofty room, with a high wainscot all round it, a carved oak screen at one end, and a broad window at the other. A very heavy table, polished by use and sadly besmirched with ink, ran down the middle of the hall, with benches on either side of it for us to use, and a high desk for Mr. Glennie stood under the window at the end of the room. Thus we were sitting one morning, with our summing slates and grammars before us, when the door in the screen opens, and Mr. Maskew enters. I have told you already of the verses which Mr. Glennie wrote for David Block's grave, and when the floods had gone down, Ratsey set up the headstone with the poetry carved on it. But Maskew, through not going to church, never saw the stone for weeks, until one morning, walking through the churchyard, he lighted on it, and knew the verses for Mr. Glennie's. So 'twas to have it out with the parson that he had come to school this day, and though we did not know so much then, yet guessed from his presence that something was in the wind, and could read in his face that he was very angry. Now, for all that we hated Maskew, yet were we glad enough to see him there, as hoping for something strange to vary the sameness of school, and scenting a disturbance in the air. Only Grace was ill at ease, for fear her father should say something unseemly, and kept her head down with shocks of hair falling over her book, though I could see her blushing between them. So, in vapours, Maskew, with an angry glance about him, makes straight for the desk, where our master sits at the top of the room. For a moment Mr. Glennie, being short-sighted, did not see who 'twas, but as his visitor drew near, rose courteously to greet him. "Good day to you, Mr. Maskew," says he, holding out his hand. But Maskew puts his arm behind his back and bubbles out, "Hold not your hands to me, lest I spit on it. 'Tis like your snivelling cant to write sweet psalms for smuggling rogues, and try to frighten honest men with your judgments." At first Mr. Glennie did not know what the other would be at, and afterwards, understanding, turned very pale, but said, as a minister, he would never be backward in reproving those whom he considered in the wrong, whether from the pulpit or from the gravestone. Then Maskew flies into a great passion, and pours out many vile and insolent words, saying Mr. Glennie is in league with the smugglers and fattens on their crimes, that the poetry is a libel, and that he, Maskew, will have the law of him for calumny. After that he took Grace by the arm, and bade her get hat and cape, and come with him. "For," says he, "I will not have thee taught any more by a psalm-slinging hypocrite that calls thy father murderer." And all the while he kept drawing up closer to Mr. Glennie until the two stood very near each other. There was a great difference between them. the one short and blustering with a red face turned up, the other tall and craning down, ill-clad, ill-fed and pale. Maskew had in his left hand a basket, with which he went marketing of mornings, for he made his own purchases and liked fish, as being cheaper than meat. He had been chaffering with the fishwives this very day, and was bringing back his provend with him when he visited our school. Then he said to Mr. Glennie, "Now, Sir Parson, the law has given into your fool's hands a power over this churchyard, and 'tis your trade to stop unseemly headlines from being set up within its walls, or, once set up, to turn them out forthwith. So I give you a week's grace, and if tomorrow se'nnight yon stone be not gone, I will have it up and flung in pieces outside the wall." Mr. Glennie answered him in a low voice, but quite clear, so that we could hear where we sat. "I can neither turn the stone out myself, nor stop you from turning it out if you so mind. But if you do this thing, and dishonour the graveyard, there is one stronger than either you or I that must be reckoned with." I knew afterwards that he meant the Almighty, but thought then that 'twas of Elzevir he spoke. And so perhaps did Mr. Maskew, for he fell into a worse rage, thrust his hand in the basket, whips out a great sole he had there, and in a twinkling dashes it on Mr. Glennie's face, with a "Then take that for an unmannerly parson, for I would not foul my fist with your mealy chops." But to see that stirred my choler, for Mr. Glennie was weak as wax, and would never have held up his hand to stop a blow, even if he were strong as Goliath. So I was for setting on Maskew, and being a stout lad for my age, could have had him on the floor easy as a baby. But as I rose from my seat, I saw he held Grace by the hand, and so hung back for a moment, and before I got my thoughts together he was gone, and I saw the tail of Grace's cape whisk round the screen door. A soul is at the best an ugly thing to have in one's face, and this soul was larger than most, for Maskew took care to get what he could for his money. So it went with a loud smack on Mr. Glennie's cheek, and then fell with another smack on the floor. At this we all laughed, as children will, and Mr. Glennie did not check us, but went back and sat very quiet at his desk. And soon I was sorry I had laughed, for he looked sad, with his face sanded and a great red patch on one side, and beside that the fin had scratched him and made a blood drop trickle down his cheek. A few minutes later the thin voice of the almshouse clock said 12, and away walked Mr. Glennie without his usual "Good day, children," and there was the soul left lying on the dusty floor in front of his desk. It seemed a shame so fine a fish should be wasted, so I picked it up and slipped it in my desk, sending Fred Burt to get his mother's gridiron that we might grill it on the schoolroom fire. While he was gone I went out to the court to play, and had not been there 5 minutes when back comes Maskew through our playground without Grace, and goes into the schoolroom. But in the screen at the end of the room was a chink, against which we used to hold our fingers on bright days for the sun to shine through, and show the blood pink. So I slipped up, up I slipped, and fixed my eye to the hole, wanting to know what he was at. He had his basket with him, and I soon saw that he had come back for the sole, not having the heart to leave so good a bit of fish. But look where he would, he could not find it, for he never searched my desk, and had to go off with a sour countenance. Fred Burt and I cooked the sole, and found it well flavoured, for all it had given so much pain to Mr. Glennie. After that Grace came no more to school, both because her father had said she should not, and because she was herself ashamed to go back after what Maskew had done to Mr. Glennie. And then it was that I took to wandering much in the manor woods, having no fear of man-traps, for I knew their place as soon as they were put down, but often catching sight of Grace, and sometimes finding occasion to talk with her. Thus time passed, and I lived with Elzevir at the Why Not, still going to school of mornings, but spending the afternoons in fishing, or in helping him in the garden, or with the boats. As soon as I got to know him well, I begged him to let me help run the cargoes, but he refused, saying I was yet too young, and must not come into mischief. Yet, later, yielding to my importunity, he consented, and more than one dark night I was in the landing boats that unburdened the lugger. though I could never bring myself to enter the Mohune vault again, but would stand as sentry at the passage mouth. And all the while I had round my neck Colonel John Mohune's locket, and at first wore it next to myself, but finding it black the skin, put it between shirt and body jacket, and there, by dint of wear, it grew less black, and showed a little of the metal underneath, and at last I took to polishing it at odd times until it came out quite white and shiny, like the pure silver that it was. Elzevir had seen this locket when he put me to bed the first time I came to the Why Not, and afterwards I told him whence I got it. But though we had it out more than once of an evening, we could never come at any hidden meaning. Indeed, we scarce tried to, judging it to be certainly a sacred charm to keep evil spirits from Blackbeard's body. Chapter 7. An Auction. What if my house be troubled with a rat, and I be pleased to give 10,000 ducats to have it baned? Shakespeare. One evening in March, when the days were lengthening fast, there came a messenger from Dorchester, and brought printed notices for fixing to the shutters of the Why Not, and to the church door, which said that in a week's time the bailiff of the Duchy of Cornwall would visit Moonfleet. This bailiff was an important person, and his visits stood as events in village history. Once in 5 years he made a perambulation or journey through the whole duchy, inspecting all the royal property and arranging for new leases. His visits to Moonfleet were generally short enough, for owing to the Mohunes owning all the land, the only duchy estate there was the Why Not. Excuse me again. And the only duty of the bailiff to renew that lease 5 years. That 5-year lease, under which Blocks had held the inn, father and son, for generations. But, for all that, the business was not performed without ceremony, for there was a solemn show of putting up the lease of the inn to the highest bidder, though it was well understood that no one except Elzevir would make an offer. So, one morning, a week later, I went up to the top end of the village to watch for the bailiff's post-chaise, and about 11 of the forenoon saw it coming down the hill with 4 horses and 2 postilions. Presently it came past, and I saw there were 2 men in it, a clerk sitting with his back to the horses, and in the seat opposite a little man in a periwig, whom I took for the bailiff. Then I ran down to my aunt's house, for Elzevir had asked me to beg one of her best winter candles for a purpose which I will explain presently. I had not seen Aunt Jane, except in church, since the day that she dismissed me, but she was no stiffer than usual, and gave me the candle readily enough. "There," she said, "take it, and I wish it may bring light into your dark heart, and show you that a wicked thing it is to leave your own kith and kin, and go to dwell in a tavern." I was for saying that it was kith and kin that left me, and not I them, and as for living in a tavern, it was better to live there than nowhere at all, as she would wish me to do in turning me out of her house, but did not, and only thanked her for the candle and was off. When I came to the inn, there was the post-chaise in front of the door, the horses being led away to bait, and a little group of villagers standing round. For though the auction of the Why Not was in itself a trite thing with a foregone conclusion, yet the bailiff's visit always stirred some show of interest. There were a few children with their noses flattened against the windows of the parlour, and inside were Mr. Bailiff and Mr. Clerk hard at work on their dinner. Mr. Bailiff, who was, as I guessed, the little man in the periwig, sat at the top of the table, and Mr. Clerk sat at the bottom, and on chairs were placed their hats and travelling cloaks and bundles of paper tied together with green tape. You may be sure that Elzevir had a good dinner for them, with hot rabbit pie and cold round of brawn, and a piece of blue vinny, which Mr. Bailiff ate heartily, but his clerk would not touch, saying that he had as lief chew soap. There was also a bottle of Ararat milk and a flagon of ale, for we were afraid to set French wines before them, lest they should fall to wondering how they were come by. Elzevir took the candle, chiding me a little for being late, and set it in a brass candlestick in the middle of the table. Then Mr. Clerk takes a little rule from his pocket, measures an inch down on the candle, sticks into the grease at that point a scarf pin with an onyx head that Elzevir lent him, and lights the wick. Now the reason of this was that the custom ran in Moonfleet when either land or lease was put up to bidding, to stick a pin in a candle, and so long as the pin held firm, it was open to any to make a better offer, but when the flame burnt down and the pin fell out, then land or lease fell to the last bidder. So after dinner was over and the table cleared, Mr. Clark takes out a roll of papers and reads a legal description of the Why Not, calling it the Mohune Arms, an excellent messuage or tenement now used as a tavern, and speaking of the convenient paddocks or parcels of grazing land at the back of it, called Moon's Lease, amounting to 16 acres more or less. Then he invites the company to make an offer of rent for such a desirable property under a 5 years lease, and, as Elzevir and I are the only company present, the bidding is soon done. For Elzevir offers a rent of £12 a year, which has always been the value of the Why Not. The clerk makes a note of this, but the business is not over yet, for we must wait till the pin drops out of the candle before the lease is finally made out. So the men fell to smoking to pass the time, till there could not have been more than 10 minutes' candle to burn, and Mr. Bailiff, with a glass of Ararat milk in his hand, was saying, "'Tis a curious and fine tap of Hollands you keep here, Master Block," when in walked Mr. Maskew. A thunderbolt would not have astonished me so much as did his appearance, and Elzevir's face grew black as night. But the bailiff and clerk showed no surprise, not knowing the terms on which persons in our village stood to one another, and thinking it natural that someone should come in to see the pin drop, and the end of an ancient custom. Indeed, Maskew seemed to know the bailiff, for he passed the time of day with him, and was then for sitting down at the table without taking any notice of Elzevir or me. But just as he began to seat himself, Block shouted out, "You are no welcome visitor in my house, and I would sooner see your back than see your face, but sit at this table you shall not." And I knew what he meant, for on that table they had laid out David's body, and with that he struck his fist upon the board so smart as to make the bailiff jump, and nearly bring the pin out of the candle. "Heyday, sirs," says Mr. Bailiff, astonished. "Let us have no brawling here, the more so as this worshipful gentleman is a magistrate, and something of a friend of mine." Yet Maskew refrained from sitting, but stood by the bailiff's chair, turning white and not red as he did with Mr. Glennie, and muttered something that he had as lief stand as sit, and that it should soon be Block's turn to ask sitting room of him. I was wondering what possibly could have brought Maskew there, when the bailiff, who was ill at ease, said, "Come, Mr. Clark, the pin hath but another minute's hold. Rehearse what has to be done, for I must get this lease delivered and off to Bridport, where much business waits." So the clerk read in a sing-song voice that the property of the Duchy of Cornwall, called the Mohune Arms, an inn or tavern with all its land, tenements, and appurtenances, situate in the parish of St. Sebastian, Moonfleet, having been offered on lease for 5 years, would be let to Elzevir Block at a rent of £12 per annum, unless anyone offered a higher rent before the pin fell from the candle. There was no one to make another offer, and the bailiff said to Elzevir, "Tell them to have the horses round. The pin will be out in a minute, and 'twill save time." So Elzevir gave the order, and then we all stood round in silence, waiting for the pin to fall. The grease had burnt down to the mark, or almost below it, as it appeared, but just where the pin stuck in there was a little lump of harder tallow that held bravely out, refusing to be melted. The bailiff gave a stamp of impatience with his foot under the table, as though he hoped thus to shake out the pin, and then a little dry voice came from Maskew, saying, "I offer £13 a year for the inn." This fell upon us with so much surprise that all looked round, seeking as it were some other speaker, never thinking that it could be Maskew. Elzevir was the first, I believe, to fully understand 'twas he, and without turning to look at bailiff or Maskew, but having his elbows on the table, his face between his hands, and looking straight out to sea, said in a sturdy voice, "I offer £20. The words were scarce out of his mouth when Maskew caps him with £21, and so, in less than a minute, the rent of the Why Not was near doubled. Then the bailiff looked from one to the other, not knowing what to make of it all, nor whether 'twas comedy or serious, and said, "Kind sirs, I warn ye not to trifle. I have no time to waste in April fooling, and he who makes offers in sport will have to stand to them in earnest." But there was no lack of earnest in one at least of the men that he had before him, and the voice with which Elzevir said £30 was still sturdy. Maskew called £31 and 41, and Elzevir 40 and 50, and then I looked at the candle and saw that the head of the pin was no longer level. It had sunk a little, a very little. The clerk awoke from his indifference and was making notes of the bids with a squeaking quill. The bailiff frowned as being puzzled, and thinking that none had a right to puzzle him. As for me, I could not sit still, but got on my feet. If so, I might better bear the suspense, for I understood now that Maskew had made up his mind to turn Elzevir out, and that Elzevir was fighting for his home. His home! And had he not made it my home too? And were we both to be made outcasts to please the spite of this mean little man? There were some more bids, and then I knew that Maskew was saying £91, and saw the head of the pin was lower. The hard lump of tallow in Aunt Jane's candle was thawing. The bailiff struck in. "Are ye mad, sirs? And you, Master Block, save your breath and spare your money. And if this worshipful gentleman must become innkeeper at any price, let him have the place in the devil's name, and I will give thee the Mermaid at Bridport, with a snug parlour, and 10 times the trade of this." Elzevir seemed not to hear what he had said, but only called out £100, with his face still looking out to sea, and the same sturdiness in his voice. Then Maskew tried a spring, and went to 120, and Elzevir capped him with 130, and 140, 150, 160, 170 followed quick. My breath came so fast that I was almost giddy, and I had to clench my hands to remind myself of where I was, and what was going on. The bidders, too, were breathing hard. Elzevir had taken his head from his hands, and the eyes of all were on the pin. The lump of tallow was worn down now. It was hard to say why the pin did not fall. Maskew gulped out £170, and Elzevir said 190, and then the pin gave a lurch, and I thought the Why Not was saved, though at the price of ruin. No, the pin had not fallen. There was a film that held it by the point. 1 second, only 1 second. Elzevir's breath, which was ready to outbid whatever Maskew said, caught in his throat with the catching pin, and Maskew sighed out £200, before the pin pattered onto the bottom of the brass candlestick. The clerk forgot his master's present and shut his notebook with a bang. "Congratulate you, sir," says he, quite pert to Maskew. "You are the landlord of the poorest pothouse in the duchy at £200 a year." The bailiff paid no heed to what his man did, but took his periwig off and wiped his head. "Well, I'm hanged," he said, and so the Why Not was lost. Just as the last bid was given, Elzevir half rose from his chair, and for a moment I expected to see him spring like a wild beast on Maskew. But he said nothing, and sat down again, with the same stolid look on his face. And indeed it was perhaps well that he thus thought better of it, for Maskew stuck his hand into his bosom as the other rose, and though he withdrew it again, when Elzevir got back to his chair, yet the front of his waistcoat was a little bulged, and, looking sideways, I saw the silver-shod butt of a pistol nestling far down against his white shirt. The bailiff was vexed, I think, that he had been betrayed into such strong words, for he tried at once to put on as indifferent an air as might be, saying in dry tones, "Well, gentlemen, there seems to be here some personal matter into which I shall not attempt to spy. £200 more or less is but a flea-bite to the duchy, and if you, sir," turning to Maskew, "wish later on to change your mind and be quit of the bargain, I shall not be the man to stand in your way. In any case, I imagine 'twill be time enough to seal the lease if I send it from London." I knew he said this, and hinted at delay as wishing to do Elzevir a good turn, for his clerk had the lease already made out pat, and had only wanted the name and rent filled in to be sealed and signed. But, "No," says Maskew, "business is business, Mr. Bailiff, and the post uncertain departs so distant from the capital as these. So I'll thank you to make out the lease to me now, and on May Day place me in possession." "So be it then," said the bailiff a little testily, "but blame me not for driving hard bargains, for the duchy, whose servant I am," and he raised his hat, "is no daughter of the horse-leech. Fill in the figures, Mr. Scrutton, and let us away." So Mr. Scrutton, for that was Mr. Clark's name, scratches a bit with his quill on the parchment sheet to fill in the money, and then Maskew scratches his name, and Mr. Bailiff scratches his name, and Mr. Clark scratches again to witness Mr. Bailiff's name, and then Mr. Bailiff takes from his mails a little shagreen case, and out from the case comes sealing wax and the travelling seal of the duchy. There was my aunt's best winter candle still burning away in the daylight, for no one had taken any thought to put it out, and Mr. Bailiff melts the wax at it, till a drop of sealing wax falls into the grease and makes a gutter down one side, and then there is a swirling on the parchment under the hot wax, and at last on goes the seal. "Signed, sealed, and delivered," says Mr. Clark, rolling up the sheet and handing it to Maskew, and Maskew takes and thrusts it into his bosom underneath his waistcoat front, all cheek by jowl with that silver-hafted pistol, whose butt I had seen before. The post-chaise stood before the door, the horses were stamping on the cobblestones, and the harness jingled. Mr. Clark had carried out his mails, but Mr. Bailiff stopped for a moment as he flung the travelling cloak about his shoulders to say to Elzevir, "Tut, man, take things not too hardly. Thou shalt have the Mermaid at £20 a year, which will be worth 10 times as much to thee as this dreary place, and canst send thy son to Bryson's school, where they will make a scholar of him, for he is a brave lad." And he touched my shoulder, and gave me a kindly look as he passed. "I thank your worship," said Elzevir, "for all your goodness, but when I quit this place, I shall not set up my staff again at any inn door." Mr. Bailiff seemed nettled to see his offer made so little of, and left the room with a stiff, "Then I wish you good day." Maskew had slipped out before him, and the children's noses left the window pane as the great man walked down the steps. There was a little group to see the start, but it quickly melted, and before the clatter of hoofs died away, the report spread through the village that Maskew had turned Elzevir out of the Why Not. For a long time after all had gone, Elzevir sat at the table with his head in his hands, and I kept quiet also, both because I was myself sorry that we were to be sent adrift, and because I wished to show Elzevir that I felt for him in his troubles. But the young cannot enter fully into their elders' sorrows, however much they may wish to, and after a time the silence palled upon me. It was getting dusk, and the candle which bore itself so bravely through auction and lease sealing burnt low in the socket. A minute later the light gave some flickering flashes, failings, and sputters, and then the wick tottered, and out popped the flame, leaving us with the chilly grey of a March evening creeping up in the corners of the room. I could bear the gloom no longer, but made up the fire till the light danced ruddy across the pewter and porcelain on the dresser. "Come, Master Block," I said. "There is time enough before May Day to think what we shall do, so let us take a cup of tea, and after that I will play you a game of backgammon." But he still remained cast down and would say nothing, and as chance would have it, though I wished to let him win at backgammon, that so perhaps he might get cheered, yet do what I would that night I could not lose. So as his luck grew worse, his moodiness increased, and at last he shut the board with a bang, saying, in reference to that motto that ran round its edge, "Life is like a game of hazard, and surely none ever flung worse throws, or made so little of them, as I." And that's the end of the chapter, and where I shall take a break. So I'm going to do that. And this is your reminder to get up and stretch and wander around and do whatever you need to do. But first of all, before we do that, actually, I've just kited you into that. I'm going to say thank you, because we have a resub from LaHump. Thank you very much, Lucy, the other person who runs this channel and reads so excellently on here, carrying me basically. Yeah, thank you for those 8 months. And Yumika, it's good to see you. Thank you for the 9 months. Been a while. Don't have time to stay. That's okay, since life has been frantic, but still a regular VOD goblin, one who expresses your ongoing appreciation. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I am being really bad about getting all these VODs up on YouTube. They are on here. I do still keep having to protest the copyright strikes and things on them, which is slowing me from getting them up on YouTube. But yes, I need to actually try and do that this week, so I need to like keep prodding myself to get on and get them all bounced over and uploaded and thumbnailed and stuff. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for those 9 months. I hope seems like you're keeping well, and glad to hear it. I hope things are good. Yeah, I'm gonna throw to a break. So, you know the drill. Rotate your fluids, stretch your legs, and we'll see you back here in like 5 minutes or so. Bye for now. that's the end of the break. Yeah, I hope everyone's well and been enjoying the stream. I'm just going to go back a little bit further and catch up on chat. I hope you're all enjoying Sam's Cornish accent. I'm doing my best. Like everyone will speak with the exact same clumsy approximation of an accent in just a varying pitch. Like Elzevir gets the gruffest voice, and everyone else is just some randomly selected pitch above that. That wasn't bad? Well, thank you. I just hope that no actual true Cornish/Devonshire locals have to hear it, because I apologise. Thunder, that's where you're sneaking in. Hey, hope you're doing well. Lovely to see you. What else? Oh, Dr. Lemzox, you met West Country 6 months ago. Some of your clients sound exactly like this. Hey, okay, I'll take that. Diana, you've heard worse. All right, okay, then good. I'll keep doing it. I wasn't going to make any changes anyway, but I shan't make any changes. See, I saw something. I saw a message pop into chat around the point when Maskew's assaulting Mr. Glennie, and I thought it was going to be about John's comment about I could have him on the floor as easily a baby, because I just loved that. It made me laugh out loud earlier when reading it, and it nearly made me crack again today, just because I love that that's where John's mind goes. It's like, oh yeah, I could totally fight a baby. Yeah, I could probably, yeah, just, you know, RKO out of nowhere a toddler. And it just, yeah, but mealy chops is also a pretty great phrase. And yeah, just this whole image of just literally assaulting with a fish, bap, across the face is, yeah. And I don't know, I really love how petty and spiteful a man it makes Maskew. Like this whole thing, I really just, yeah, I absolutely hate the character. Well, I hate the man, and yeah. For me, a simple person, I feel like Faulkner has done a good job of setting up this just horrible man. Although I do hate that he's kind of the miserly, ginger-haired Scottish stereotype. It's like you don't have to do that. He could just be a bad guy without leaning on that. That's fine. Which is why I'm not doing the accent for him, because it's like we could move away from that. We could do a little better. But yeah, don't bring back the tombstoning a toddler. I didn't. Faulkner did. Was an extremely well described fish slap, right? He really got into that. There's like some granularity there in the detail of how it happened. It wasn't just he hit him in the face with a soul. There was like depth. Yeah, it's very, very Monty Python. Happy you went back to get the fish and it wasn't there. Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, should have thought about that. Anyway, I'm talking way too long for the post-break chat. We'll do some of this at the end of the stream as well, because we have more. We have Chapter 8. That's me working out Roman numerals. I can count to 8 in numerals. Do you know? I shall continue. Chapter 8. The Landing. Let my lamp at midnight hour be seen in some high lonely tower. Milton. Sorry for the creaky chair, but I had some ambience. Maskew got ugly looks from the men, and sour words from the wives, as he went up through the village that afternoon, for all knew what he had done, and for many days yet after the auction he durst not show his face abroad. Yet Damon of Ringstave and some others of the Landers men, who made it their business to keep an eye upon him, said that he had been twice to Weymouth of evenings, and held converse there with Mr. Luckham of the excise, and with Captain Henning, who commanded the troopers then in quarters of the Noath. And by degrees it got about, but how I do not know, that he had persuaded the revenue to strike hard at the smugglers, and that a strong posse was to be held in readiness to take the Landers in the act the next time they should try to run a cargo. Why Maskew should so put himself about to help the revenue I cannot tell, nor did anyone ever certainly find out. But some said 'twas out of sheer wantonness, and a desire to hurt his neighbours, and others that he saw what an apt place this was for landing cargoes, and wished to make a brave show of zeal for the excise, and afterwards to get the whole of the contraband trade into his own hands. However that may be, I think he was certainly in league with the revenue men, and more than once I saw him on a manor terrace with a spyglass in his hand, and guessed that he was looking for the lugger in the offing. Now, word was mostly given to the lander by safe hands of the night of which a cargo should be run, and then in the morning or afternoon the lugger would come just near enough the land to be made out with glasses, and afterwards lie off again out of sight till nightfall. The nights chosen for such work were without moon, but as still as might be, so long as there was wind enough to fill the sails, and often the lugger could be made out from the beach, but sometimes 'twas necessary to signal with flares, though they were used as little as might be. Yet, after there had been a long spell of rough weather, and a cargo had to be run at all hazards, I have known the boats come in even on the bright moonlight and take their risk, for 'twas said the excise slept sounder round us than anywhere in all the channel. These tales of Maskew's doings failed not to reach Elzevir, and for some days he thought best not to move, though there was a cargo on the other side that wanted landing badly. But one evening, when he had won at backgammon, and was in an open mood, he took me into confidence, setting down the dice-box on the table and saying, "There is word come from the shippers that we must take a cargo. For that they cannot keep the stuff by them longer at St. Malo. Now, with this devil at the manor prowling around, I dare not risk the job on Moonfleet beach, nor yet stow the liquor in the vault. So I have told the Bonaventure to put her nose into this bay tomorrow afternoon, that Maskew may see her, well, and then to lie out at sea again, as she has done 100 times before. But instead of waiting in the offing, she will make straight off up channel, to a little strip of shingle underneath her head." I nodded to show I knew the place, and he went on. "Men used to choose that spot in good old times to beach a cargo before the passage to the vault was dug, and there is a worked-out quarry they call Pygrove's Hole, not too far off up the down, and choked with brambles, where we can find shelter for 100 kegs. So we'll be under her head at 5 tomorrow morning with a pack of horses. I wish we could be earlier, for the sun riseth thereabout, but the tide will not serve before." It was at that moment that I felt a cold touch on my shoulders, as of the fresh air from outside, and being assaulted by a cat here, and thought beside I had a whiff of salt seaweed from the beach. So round I looked to see if door or window stood ajar. The window was tight enough and shuttered to boot, but the door was not to be seen plainly for a wooden screen, which parted it from the parlour, and was meant to keep off draughts. Yet I could just see a top corner of the door above the screen, and thought it was not fast. So up I got to shut it, for the nights were cold. But coming round the corner of the screen, found that 'twas closed, and yet I could have sworn I saw the latch fall to its place as I walked towards it. Then I dashed forward, and in a trice had the door open and was in the street. But the night was moonless and black, and I neither saw nor heard aught stirring, save the gentle sea-wash on Moonfleet beach beyond the salt meadows. Elzevir looked at me uneasily as I came back. "What ails thee, boy?" said he. "I thought I heard someone at the door," I answered. "Did you not feel a cold wind as if it was open?" "It is but the night is sharp. The spring sets in very chill. Slip the bolt and sit down again." And he flung a fresh log on the fire that sent a cloud of sparks crackling up the chimney and out into the room. "Elzevir," I said, "I think there was someone listening at the door, and there may be others in the house, so before we sit again, let us take the candle and go through the rooms to make sure none are prying on us." And he laughed and said, "'Twas but the wind that blew the door open." But that I might do as I pleased. So I lit another candle and was for starting on my search, but he cried, "Nay, thou shalt not go alone." And so we went all round the house together, and he found not so much as a mouse stirring. He laughed the more when we came back to the parlour. "'Tis the cold has chilled thy heart and made thee timid of that skulking rascal of the manor. Fill me a glass of arrowroot milk, and one for thyself, and let us to bed." I had learned by this not to be afraid of the good liquor, and while we sat sipping it, Elzevir went on. "There is a fortnight yet to run, and then you and I shall be cut adrift from our moorings. It is a cruel thing to see the doors of this house closed on me, where I and mine have lived a century or more, but I must see it. Yet let us not be too cast down, but try to make something even of the worst of throes." I was glad enough to hear him speak in this firmer strain, for I had seen what a sore thought it had been for these days past that he must leave the Why Not, and how it often made him moody and downcast. "We will have no more of innkeeping," he said. "I have been sick and tired of it this many a day, and care not now to see men abuse good liquor and addle their silly pates to fill my purse. And I have something, boy, put snug away in Dorchester town, that will give us bread to eat and beer to drink, even if the throws run still due ace. But we must seek a roof to shelter us when the Why Not is shut, and 'tis best we leave this Moonfleet of ours for a season, till Maskew finds a rope's end long enough to hang himself withal. So when our work is done tomorrow night, we will walk out along the cliff to Worth, and take a look at a cottage there that Damon spoke about, with a walled orchard at the back, and fuchsia hedge in front. 'Tis near the Lobster Inn, and has a fine prospect of the sea. And if we live there, we will leave the vault alone a while, and use this Pygrove's hole for storehouse till the watch is relaxed." I did not answer, having my thoughts on other things, and he tossed off his liquor, saying, "Thou art tired, so let's to bed, for we shall get little sleep tomorrow night." It was true that I was tired, and yet I could not get to sleep, but tossed and turned in my bed for thinking of many things, and being vexed that we were to leave Moonfleet. Yet mine was a selfish sorrow, for I had little thought for Elzevir and the pain that it must be to him to quit the Why Not, nor yet was it the grief of leaving Moonfleet that so troubled me, although that was the only place I had ever known, and seemed to me then, as now, the only spot on earth fit to be lived in. But the real care and canker was that I was going away from Grace Maskew. For since she had left school, I had grown fonder of her, and now that it was difficult to see her, I took the more pains to accomplish it, and met her sometimes in Manor Woods, and more than once, when Maskew was away, had walked with her on Weatherbeach Hill. So we bred up a boy and girl affection, and must needs pledge ourselves to be true to one another, not knowing what such silly words might mean. And I told Grace all my secrets, not even excepting the doings of the contraband and the Mohune vault and Blackbeard's locket, for I knew all was as safe with her as with me, and that her father could never rack aught from her. Nay, more, her bedroom was at the top of the gabled wing of the manor house, and looked right out to sea, and one clear night when our boat was coming late from fishing, I saw her candle burning there, and next day told her of it. And then she said that she would set a candle to burn before the panes on winter nights, and be a leading light for boats at sea. And so she did, and others beside me saw and used it, calling it Maskew's match, and saying that it was the attorney sitting up all night to pore over ledgers and add up his fortune. So this night, as I lay awake, I vexed myself for thinking of her, and at last resolved to go up next morning to the Manor Woods and lie in wait for Grace, to tell her what was up, and that we were going away to Worth. Next day, the 16th of April, a day I have had cause to remember all my life, I played truant from Mr. Glennie, and by 10 in the forenoon found myself in the woods. There was a little dimple on the hillside above the house, green with burdocks in summer and filled with dry leaves in winter, just big enough to hold one lying flat, and not so deep but that I could look over the lip of it and see the house without being seen. Thither I went that day, and lay down in the dry leaves to wait and watch for Grace. The morning was bright enough. The chills of the night before had given way to sunlight that seemed warm as summer, and yet had with it the soft freshness of spring. There was scarce a breath moving in the wood, though I could see the clouds of white dust stalking up the road that climbs ridge down, and the trees were green with buds, yet without leafage to keep the sunbeams from lighting up the ground below, which glowed with yellow kingcups. So I lay there for a long, long while, and to make time pass quicker took from my bosom the silver locket, and, opening it, read again the parchment which I had read times out of mind before, and knew indeed by heart. The days of our age are 60 years and 10, and the rest. Now whenever I handled the locket my thoughts were turned to Mohune's treasure, and it was natural that it should be so, for the locket reminded me of my first journey to the vault, and I laughed at myself, remembering how simple I had been, and had hoped to find the place littered with diamonds, and to see the gold lying packed in heaps. And thus, for the 100th time, I came to rack my brain to know where the diamond could be hid, and thought at last it must be buried in the churchyard, because of the talk of Blackbeard being seen on wild nights digging there for his treasure. But then, I reasoned, that very like it was the contrabandiers whom men had seen with spades when they were digging out the passage from the tomb to the vault, and set them down for ghosts because they wrought at night. And while I was busy with such thoughts, the door opened in the house below me, and out came Grace with a hood on her head and a basket for wildflowers in her hand. I watched to see which way she would walk, and as soon as she took the path that leads up Weatherbeach, made off through the dry brushwood to meet her, for we had settled she should never go that road except when Maskew was away. So there we met and spent an hour together on the hill, though I shall not write here what we said, because it was mostly silly stuff. She spoke much of the auction and of Elzevir leaving the Why Not, and though she never said a word against her father, let me know what pain his doings gave her. But most she grieved that we were leaving Moonfleet, and showed her grief in such pretty ways as made me almost glad to see her sorry. And from her I learned that Maskew was indeed absent from home, having been called away suddenly last night. The evening was so fine, he said, and this surprised me, remembering how dark and cold it was with us, that he must needs walk round the policies. But about 9 o'clock came back and told her he had got a sudden call to business which would take him to Weymouth and then and there. So to saddle, and off he went on his mare, bidding Grace not to look for him for 2 nights to come. I know not why it was, but what she said of Maskew made me thoughtful and silent, and she, too, must be back home lest the old servant that kept house for them should say she had been away too long, and so we parted. Then off I went through the woods and down the village street, but as I passed my old home saw Aunt Jane standing on the doorstep. I bade her good day, and was for running on to the Why Not, for I was late enough already, but she called me to her, seeming in a milder mood, and said she had something for me in the house. So left me standing while she went off to get it, and back she came and thrust into my hand a little prayer book, which I had often seen about the parlour in the past days, saying, "Here is a common prayer which I had meant to send thee with thy clothes. It was thy poor mother's, and I pray may some day be as precious a balm to thee as it once was to that godly woman." With that she gave me the good day, and I pocketed the little red leather book, which did, indeed, afterwards prove precious to me, though not in the way she meant, and ran down street to the Why Not. That same evening Elzevir and I left the Why Not, went up through the village, climbed the down, and were at the brow by sunset. We had started earlier than we fixed the night before, because word had come to Elzevir that morning that the tide, called Gulder, would serve for the beaching of the Bonaventure at 3 instead of 5. 'Tis a strange thing, the Gulder, and not even sailors can count closely with it, for on the Dorset coast the tide makes 4 times a day, twice with the common flow and twice with the Gulder, and this last being shifty and uncertain as to time, flings out many a sea reckoning. It was about 7 o'clock when we were at the top of the hill, and there were 15 good miles to cover to get to Hoare Head. Dusk was upon us before we had walked half an hour, but when the light fell, it was not black as on the last evening, but a deep sort of blue, and the heat of the day did not die with the sun, but left the air still warm and balmy. We trudged on in silence, and were glad enough when we saw by a white stone here and there at the side of the path that we were nearing the cliff. for the preventive men marks all the footpaths on the cliff with whitewashed stones, so that one can pick up the way without risk on a dark night. A few minutes more, and we reached a broad piece of open sward, which I knew for the top of Hoar Head. Hoar Head is the highest of the line of cliffs, which stretches 20 miles from Weymouth to St Albans Head, and it stands up 80 fathoms or more above the water. The seaward side is a great sheer of chalk, but falls not straight into the sea, for 3 parts down there is a lower ledge, or terrace, called the Undercliff. 'Twas to this ledge that we were bound, and though we were now straight above, I knew we had a mile or more to go before we could get down to it. So on we went again, and found the bridle path that slopes down through the deep dip in the cliff line, and when we reached this underledge I looked up at the sky, the night being clear, and guessed by the stars that 'twas past midnight. I knew the place from having once been there for blackberries, for the brambles on the undercliff, being sheltered every way but the south, and open to the sun, grow the finest in all these parts. We were not alone, for I could make out a score of men, some standing in groups, some resting on the ground, and the dark shapes of the pack-horses showing larger in the dimness. There were a few words of greeting muttered in deep voices, and then all was still, so that one heard the browsing of horses trying to crop something off the turf. It was not the first cargo I had helped to run, and I knew most of the men, but did not speak with them, being tired and wishing to rest till I was wanted. So cast myself down on the turf, but had not lain there long when I saw someone coming to me through the brambles, and Master Ratsey said, "Well, Jack, so thou and Elzevir are leaving Moonfleet, and I fain would flit myself, but then who would be left to lead the old folks to their last homes, for dead do not bury their dead in these days?" I was half asleep, and took little heed of what he said, putting him off with, "That need not keep you, master. They will find others to fill your place." Yet he would not let me be, but went on talking for the pleasure of hearing his own voice. "Nay, child, you know not what you say. They may find men to dig a grave, and perhaps to fill it, but who shall toss the mould when Parson Glennie gives the earth to earth? It takes a mort of knowledge to make it rattle kindly on the coffin lid." I felt sleep heavy on my eyelids, and was for begging him to let me rest, when there came a whistle from below, and in a moment all were on their feet. The drivers went to the pack-horses' heads, and so we walked down to the strand, a silent, moving group of men and horses mixed, and before we came to the bottom heard the first boat's nose grind on the beach, and the feet of the seamen crunching in the pebbles. Then all fell to the business of landing, and a strange enough scene it was, what with the medley of men, the lanterns swinging, and the frothy liquor from the sea running up till sometimes it was over our boots. And all the time there was a patter of French and Dutch, for most of the Bonaventure's men were foreigners. But I shall not speak more of this, for after all one landing is very like another, and kegs come ashore in much the same way, whether they are to pay excise or not. It must have been 3 o'clock before the luggers' boats were off again to sea, and by that time the horses were well laden, and most of the men had a keg or two to carry beside. Then Elzevir, who was in command, gave the word, and we began to file away from the beach up to the undercliff. Now, what with the cargo being heavy, we were longer than usual in getting away, and though there was no sign of sunrise, yet the night was greyer, and not so blue as it had been. We reached the undercliff, and were moving across it to address ourselves to the bridle path, and so wind sideways up the steep, when I saw something moving behind one of the clumps of brambles with which the place is beset. It was only a glimpse of motion that I had perceived, and could not say whether 'twas man or animal, or even frightened bird behind the bushes. But others had seen it as well. There was some shouting, 6 flung down their kegs and started in pursuit. All eyes were turned to the bridle path, and in a twinkling hunters and hunted were in view. The greyhounds were Damon and Garrett, with some others, and the hare was an older man, who leapt and bounded forward, faster than I should have thought any but a youth could run. But then he knew what men were after him, and that 'twas a race for life. For though it was but a moment before all were lost in the night, yet this was long enough to show me that the man was none other than Maskew, and I knew that his life was not worth 10 minutes' purchase. Now, I hated this man, and had myself suffered something at his hand, besides seeing him put much grievous suffering on others. But I wished then with all my heart he might escape, and had a horrible dread of what was to come. Yet I knew all the time escape was impossible, for though Maskew ran desperately, the way was steep and stony, and he had behind him some of the fleetest feet along the coast. We had all stopped with one accord, as not wishing to move a step forward till we had seen the issue of the chase, and I was near enough to look into Elsevier's face, but saw there neither passion nor bloodthirstiness, but only a calm resolve, as if he had to deal with something well expected. We had not long to wait, for very soon we heard a rolling of stones and trampling of feet coming down the path, and from the darkness issued a group of men, heaving Maskew in the middle of them. They were hustling him along fast, 2 having hold of him by the arms, and a 3rd by the neck of his shirt behind. The sight gave me a sick qualm, like an overdose of tobacco, for it was the first time I had ever seen a man manhandled, and a fellow creature abused. His cap was lost, and his thin hair tangled over his forehead. His coat was torn off, so that he stood in his waistcoat alone. He was pale, and gasped terribly, whether from the sharp run, or from violence, or fear, or all combined. There was a babble of voices when they came up, of desperate men who had a bitterest enemy in their clutch, and some shouted, "Club him! Shoot him! Hang him!" while others were for throwing him over the cliff. And then someone saw under the flap of his waistcoat that same silver-hafted pistol that lay so lately next the lease of the Why Not, and snatching it from him, flung it on the grass at Block's feet. But Elsevier's deep voice mastered their contentions. "Lads, you remember how I said when this man's reckoning day should come, 'twas I would reckon with him, and had your promise to it. Nor is it right that any should lay hand on him but I, for is he not sealed to me with my son's blood? So touch him not, but bind him hand and foot, and leave him here with me, and go your ways. There is no time to lose, for the light grows apace." There was a little muttered murmuring, but Elsevier's will overbore them here as it had done in the vault, and they yielded the more easily, because every man knew in his heart that he would never see Maskew alive again. So within 10 minutes all were winding up the bridle path, horses and men, all except 3, for there were left upon the brambly green sward of the undercliff Maskew and Elsevier and I, and the pistol lay at Elsevier's feet. I'm just going to have some water between chapters. 1 second. Worry not, it's bottled, so I can't throw it all across the desk. Chapter 9. A Judgment. Let them fight it out, friend. Things have gone too far. God must judge the couple. Leave them as they are. Browning. I made as if I would follow the others, not wishing to see what I must see if I stayed behind, and knowing that I was powerless to bend Elsevier from his purpose. But he called me back, and bade me wait with him, for that I might be useful by and by. So I waited, but was only able to make a dreadful guess at how I might be of use, and feared the worst. Maskew sat on the sward with his hands lashed tight behind his back, and his feet tied in front. They had set him with his shoulders against a great block of weather-worn stone that was half buried and half stuck up out of the turf. There he sat, keeping his eyes on the ground, and was breathing less painfully than when he was first brought, but still very pale. Elsevier stood with the lantern in his hand, looking at Maskew with a fixed gaze, and we could hear the hoofs of the heavy-laden horses beating up the path till they turned the corner, and all was still. The silence was broken by Maskew. "Unloose me, villain, and let me go. I am a magistrate of this country, and if you do not, I will have you gibbeted on this cliff-top." They were brave words enough, yet seemed to me but bad play-acting. and brought to my remembrance how, when I was a little fellow, Mr. Glennie once made me recite a battle piece of Mr. Dryden before my betters, and how I could scarce get out the bloody threats for shyness and rising tears. So it was with Maskew's words, for he had much ado to gather breath to say them, and they came in a thin voice that had no sting or wrath or passion in it. Then Elzevir spoke to him, not roughly, but resolved, and yet with melancholy, like a judge sentencing a prisoner. Talk not to me of gibbets, for thou wilt neither hang nor see men hanged again. A month ago, thou satst under my roof, watching the flame burn down till the pin dropped, and gave thee right to turn me out from my old home. And now, this morning, thou shalt watch that flame again, for I will give thee 1 more inch of candle, and when the pin drops, will put this thine own pistol to thy head, and kill thee with as little thought as I would kill a stoat or other vermin. Then he opened the lantern side, took out from his neckcloth that same pin with the onyx head which he had used in the Why Not, and fixed it in the tallow a short inch from the top, setting the lantern down upon the sward in front of Maskew. As for me, I was dismayed beyond telling at these words, and made giddy with the revulsion of feeling, for whereas but a few minutes ago I would have thought nothing too bad for Maskew, now I was turned round to wish he might come off with his life, and to look with terror upon Elzevir. I had grown much lighter, but not yet with the rosy flush of sunrise, only the stars had faded out, and the deep blue of the night given way to a misty grey. The light was strong enough to let all things be seen, but not to call the dew tints back to them. So I could see cliffs and ground, bushes and stones and sea, and all were of one pearly grey colour, or rather they were colourless, but the most colourless and greyest thing of all was Maskew's face. His hair had got awry, and his head showed much balder than when it was well trimmed. His face, too, was drawn with heavy lines, and there were rings under his eyes. Besides all that, he had got an ugly fall in trying to escape, and one cheek was muddied, and down it trickled a blood drop where a stone had cut him. He was a sorry sight enough, and looking at him, I remembered that day in the schoolroom when this very man had struck the parson, and how our master had sat patient under it, with a blood drop trickling down his cheek too. Maskew kept his eyes fixed for a long time on the ground, but raised them at last, and looked at me with a vacant yet pity-seeking look. Now, till that moment I had never seen a trace of grace in his features, nor of him in hers. And yet as he gazed at me then, there was something of her present in his face, even battered as it was, so that it seemed as if she looked at me behind his eyes. And that made me the sorrier for him, and at last I felt I could not stand by and see him done to death. When Elzevir had stuck the pin into the candle, he never shut the slide again, and though no wind blew, there was a light breath moving in the morning off the sea, that got inside the lantern and set the flame askew. And so the candle guttered down one side till but little tallow was left above the pin, for though the flame grew pale and paler to the view in the growing morning light, yet it burnt freely all the time. So at last there was left, as I judged, but a quarter of an hour to run before the pin should fall. And I saw that Maskew knew this as well as I, for his eyes were fixed on the lantern. At last he spoke again, but the brave words were gone, and the thin voice was thinner. He had dropped threats, and was begging piteously for his life. "Spare me," he said. "Spare me, Mr. Block. I have an only daughter and a young girl with none but me to guard her. Would you rob a young girl of her only help and cast her on the world? Would you have them find me dead upon the cliff and bring me back to her on a bloody corpse?" Then Elzevir answered, "And had I not an only son, and was he not brought back to me a bloody corpse? Whose pistol was it that flashed in his face and took his life away? Do you not know? It was this very same that shall flash in yours. So make what peace you may with God, for you have little time to make it." And with that he took the pistol from the ground where it had lain, and turning his back on Maskew walked slowly to and fro among the bramble clumps. Though Maskew's words about his daughter seemed but to feed Elsevier's anger by leading him to think of David, they sank deep in my heart. And if it had seemed a fearful thing before to stand by and see a fellow creature butchered, it seemed now 10,000 times more fearful. And when I thought of Grace, and what such a deed would mean to her, my pulse beat so fierce that I must needs spring to my feet and run to reason with Elsevier, and tell him this must not be. He was still walking among the bushes when I found him, and let me say my say till I was out of breath, and bore with me if I talked fast, and if my tongue outran my judgment. "Thou hast a warm heart, lad," he said, "and 'tis for that I like thee. And if thou hast a chief place in thy heart for me, I cannot grumble if thou find a little room there even for our enemies. Would I could set thy soul at ease, and do all that thou askest. In the first flush of wrath, when he was taken, plotting against our lives, it seemed a little thing enough to take his evil life. But now these morning airs have cooled me, and it goes against my will to shoot a cowering hound tied hand and foot, even though he had murdered 20 sons of mine. I have thought if there had been any way to spare his life, and leave this hour's agony to read a lesson not to be unlearned until the grave. For such poltroons dread death, and in 1 hour they die 100 times. But there is no way out. His life lies in the scale against the lives of all our men, yes, and thy life too. They left him in my hands, well knowing I should take account of him. And am I now to play them false and turn him loose again to hang them all? It cannot be. Still I pleaded hard for Maskew's life, hanging on Elsevier's arm, and using every argument that I could think of to soften his purpose. But he pushed me off, and though I saw that he was loath to do it, I had a terrible conviction that he was not a man to be turned back from his resolve, and would go through with it to the end. We came back together from the brambles to the piece of sward, and there sat Maskew where we had left him with his back against the stone. Only, while we were away, he had managed somehow to wriggle his watch out of the fob, and it lay beside him on the turf, tied to him with a black silk ribbon. The face of it was turned upwards, and as I passed I saw the hand pointed to 5. Sunrise was very near, for though the cliff shut out the east from us, the west over Portland was all aglow with copper red and gold, and the candle burnt low. The head of the pin was drooping, though very slightly, just as I saw it droop a month before, and I knew that the final act was not far off. Maskew knew it too, for he made his last appeal, using such passionate words as I cannot now relate, and wriggling with his body as if to get his hands from behind his back and hold them up in supplication. He offered money, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 pounds to be set free. He would give back the why not. He would leave Moonfleet, and all the while the sweat ran down his furrowed face, and at last his voice was choked with sobs, for he was crying for his life in craven fear. He might have spoken to a deaf man for all he moved his judge, and Elsevier's answer was to cock the pistol and prime the powder in the pin. Then I stuck my fingers in my ears and shut my eyes that I might neither see nor hear what followed, but in a second changed my mind and opened them again, for I had made a great resolve to stop this matter, come what might. Maskew was making a dreadful sound between a moan and strangled cry, and almost seemed as if he thought that there were others by him beside Elsevier and me, and was shouting to them for help. The sun had risen, and his first rays blazed on a window far away in the west on top of Portland Island, and then there was a tinkle in the inside of the lantern, and the pin fell. Elsevier looked full at Maskew and raised the pistol. But before he had time to take aim, I dashed upon him like a wild cat, springing on his right arm and crying to stop him. It was an unequal struggle, a lad, though full-grown and lusty, against one of the powerfulest of men, but indignation nerved my arms, and his were weak because he doubted of his right. So 'twas with some effort that he shook me off, and in the struggle the pistol was fired into the air. Then I let go of him, and stumbled for a moment, tired with that bout, but pleased withal because I saw what peace even so short a respite had brought to Maskew. for at the pistol shot 'twas as if a mask of horror had fallen from his face and left him his old countenance again. And then I saw he turned his eyes toward the cliff top, and thought that he was looking up in thankfulness to heaven. But now a new thing happened, for before the echoes of that pistol shot had died on the keen morning air, I thought I heard a noise of distant shouting, and looked about to see whence it could come. Elzevir looked round too, forgetting to upbraid me for making him miss his aim, but Maskew still kept his face turned up towards the cliff. Then the voices came nearer, and there was a mingled sound as of men shouting to one another, and gathering in from different places. 'Twas from the cliff top that the voices came, and thither Elzevir and I looked up, and there, too, Maskew kept his eyes fixed, and in a moment there were a score of men stood on the cliff's edge high above our heads. The sky behind them was pink flushed with the keenest light of the young day, and they stood out against it sharp cut and black as the silhouette of my mother that used to hang up by the parlour chimney. They were soldiers, and I knew the tall mitre caps of the 13th, and saw the shafts of light from the sunrise come flashing round their bodies and glance off the barrels of their matchlocks. I knew it all now. It was the posse who had lain in ambush. Elzevir saw it too, and then all shouted at once. "Yield at the king's command! You are our prisoners!" calls the voice of one of those black silhouettes far up on the cliff top. "We are lost!" cries Elzevir. "It is the posse, but if we die this traitor should go before us!" And he makes towards Maskew to brain him with the pistol. "Shoot! Shoot in the devil's name!" screams Maskew, "or I am a dead man!" Then there came a flash of fire along the black line of silhouettes, with a crackle like a near peal of thunder, and a phut, phut, phut of bullets in the turf. And before Elzevir could get at him, Maskew had fallen over on the sward with a groan, and with a little red hole in the middle of his forehead. "Run for the cliffside!" cried Elzevir to me. "Get close in, and they cannot touch thee!" And he made for the chalk wall. But I had fallen on my knees like a bullock felled by a poleaxe, and had a scorching pain in my left foot. Elzevir looked back. "What, have they hit thee too?" he said, and ran and picked me up like a child. And then there was another flash, and phut, phut in the turf. But the shots find no billet this time, and we are lying close against the cliff, panting, but safe. And that's the end of the chapter, and where I shall finish reading things for tonight. So thank you for listening.